coups, betrayal, and the birth of democracy. The secret history of ancient Greece. 623 BC. Everyone in Athens is fast asleep, but at the foot of the Acropolis, armed men are silently advancing through the shadows. Their leader is Cylon, a former Olympic champion, the son of a noble family. But tonight, he's not an athlete, he's a coup plotter. Cylon's plan is simple but audacious. Seize Athens' sacred citadel, overthrow the oligarchy, and establish one-man rule. If he had succeeded, democratic Athens might never have been born. But what happened that night would become one of the most tragicomic coup attempts in the ancient world. This story isn't just about a failed coup. This is the beginning of the deadly struggle between oligarchy and tyranny, the rise of the merchant class, and ultimately the birth of democracy. And the mathematics, philosophy, even modern politics, all have their roots in these conflicts. Welcome to 7th-6th century BC Greece, the age of blood, betrayal, and revolution. Cylon wasn't a randomly chosen coup plotter. The man had been a champion at the Olympic Games, came from a noble family, and most importantly, he had a powerful supporter. His father-in-law, Theogenes, had seized the nearby city of Megara and ruled there alone. And Theogenes' formula for success was very interesting. Theogenes had used popular anger against the elites. He taxed the rich and invested in major infrastructure projects, giving jobs to the unemployed. He even built an aqueduct that the Romans would later admire. So the model Cylon was following was a very successful one. But in Athens, things didn't go according to plan. When Cylon's armed gang began besieging the Acropolis, the Athenian oligarchy also sprang into action. And here the tragicomic event began. When Cylon's men realized things were going badly, they took refuge in the Temple of Athena. According to ancient Greek tradition, people who sought sanctuary in temples were protected. They couldn't be touched. But the Athenians found a very creative solution. They told the supplicants, "Okay, we won't kill you, but you need to come out." What did Cylon's men do? They tied a rope to the temple altar and began coming out holding that rope. Their thinking was, as long as we're connected to the altar, we're under the temple's protection. But as you might guess, the rope broke. And the moment it broke, Athenian soldiers slaughtered them all. Thus ended perhaps the most absurd coup attempt in ancient history. But the story doesn't end here, because the consequences of this massacre would fundamentally change Athenian history. Cylon's coup failed, but the movement he represented was gaining strength throughout the Greek world. In the 8th and 7th centuries BC, most Greek city-states were ruled by oligarchies. That is, a small elite group held all the power. But the people's patience was wearing thin, and powerful leaders who saw this as an opportunity began seizing city-states one by one. We call these tyrants. But note, this didn't mean bad guys in today's sense. It simply meant ruling alone. In Corinth, Cypselus overthrew the famous Bacchiadae clan and came to power. After him, his son Periander took the throne and was so successful that he became one of Greece's 7 sages. So actually, these tyrants weren't such bad rulers. The policies of the tyrannical period were very interesting. To keep the elites under control, they focused on winning popular support. They increased free workers' wages by limiting the number of slaves. They launched major public works. They increased security measures. They even limited prostitution, which was especially popular among those with little extra money. But the elites weren't idle either. When they overthrew tyrants, they developed different strategies to keep the people under control. When tyranny ended in Corinth in 581 BC, the new government launched the Isthmian Games. In 573 BC, the Nemean Games were organized in Sicyon. The strategy was clever. Big festivals, regular entertainment, keep the people busy so they don't think about political issues. The Romans would later call this bread and circuses, but the Greeks had discovered this method much earlier. During this period, Greek colonies were also experiencing very interesting political experiments, especially the Greek cities in southern Italy, which we call Magna Graecia, displayed the most extreme examples of oligarchic governments. Rhegium had an aristocratic constitution, but how did this aristocracy work? The richest 1,000 citizens controlled everything. Locri had a system called the 100 houses, meaning only 100 families held all the power. There was also an assembly of 1,000 wealthy citizens. The city of Taras tried to copy the Spartan model. but they weren't as successful as the Spartans. Sybaris, on the other hand, represented the opposite, ruled by an oligarchy, but also became the center of hedonism and luxury. In fact, the word Sybarite began to be used to mean a person living in excessive luxury. But Sybaris met a tragic end. In 510 to 509 BC, it was completely destroyed by the rival city Croton. And this wasn't just defeat. The entire population was massacred. It was one of the most horrific genocides of the ancient world. There were also tyrants in the Western Greek world, and these were even more ruthless. Panetius of Leontini came to power around 608 BC and declared himself the protector of the poor. Valerius of Acragas ruled for 16 years, from 517 BC onward, and became famous for his extreme cruelty. But the most extreme was Aristodemus of Cumae. He was a war hero who had defeated the Etruscans. But when he came to power, he killed or enslaved the oligarchic families while freeing the existing slaves. It was a complete populist revolution. Now let's return to Athens. Cylon's coup had failed, but Megacles, who was responsible for the massacre, and the Alcmaeonid family were considered to have committed a crime, because killing those who had sought sanctuary in a temple was a violation of sacred laws. Therefore, the Alcmaeonid family was exiled from Athens. This exile was very important because the Alcmaeonid family would return in the future and become the leader of the pro-democratic faction. They would support Pericles and oppose Socrates and his circle. So the effect of the Cylon affair would influence Athenian politics for centuries. But Megacles' downfall paved the way for another's rise. Solon, this man who lived between 630 and 560 BC, would fundamentally change Athenian history. Solon's story was very interesting. He came from the distinguished Eupatrid clan and was probably descended from Codrus, Athens' last king. So he was a complete aristocrat, but he hadn't been involved in the Alcmaeonid affairs, which gave him an advantage. Solon made a clever move. He brought a seer from Crete and cleansed the city from the ritual pollution brought by the Cylon massacre. This event immediately made him a popular figure, but Solon was already wealthy because he was a pioneer of a new business: maritime trade. Trade had always been part of Greek society, but was of limited importance. Aristocratic families considered trade a lowly profession. This was the case not only in Greece, but everywhere in the world. Land was considered the basis of wealth. But by Solon's time, most large city-states didn't have enough agricultural land to feed their population. Therefore, merchants became key players in local politics. The rise of the merchant class had massive effects on Greek and human history. First, the abstract numbers that merchants used in their commercial accounts later became the starting point for philosophical reasoning. Beginning with Thales of Miletus, a contemporary of Solon, the Greeks developed mathematics and mathematical reasoning. This was a logical consequence of dealing with numbers. Of course, other civilizations also knew mathematics. Mesopotamia, the Indus, Egypt, and China all did complex calculations. Especially China was very advanced in river control technology to establish the central state in 221 BC. But the difference was this: mathematics in river civilizations was practical, necessary for flood control. Merchants, because they worked on credit and trust, were better at abstract value calculations. Merchants were also urban people, and their social organization was based on city interests rather than family interests. This concept was completely foreign to Chinese thinkers, for example. From around 650 BC, merchant interests came to the fore, and these often clashed with tyrants, because tyrants could destroy years of accumulation for personal motives. Merchants tended towards strengthening popular assemblies, which they could easily control through client networks and bribery. Most city-states, including non-democratic ones, had assemblies. Oligarchies kept them with limited powers, and tyrants also summoned assemblies from time to time. Sometimes when these assemblies seized power, tyranny was replaced by either a new oligarchy or democracy, or it led to civil war. To show how turbulent this period was, look at this figure. In ancient sources, 279 civil wars are recorded in 122 different city-states during Greece's Archaic and Classical periods. This means that on average, each city-state experienced witnessed at least 2 civil wars. This chaos wasn't random. This was the collapse of the old order and the birth pangs of the new order. Oligarchy, tyranny, democracy, all were tried, tested, and developed during this period. So what came out of this bloodshed? A lot. The foundations of modern democracy were laid during this period. Mathematics and philosophy were born in this chaos. The political power of the merchant class formed the foundations of capitalism. Even Cylon's failed coup produced important results. The exile of the Alcmaeonid family led to the strengthening of the democratic movement in Athens. Solon's reforms tried to address injustices. And most importantly, this period showed that political systems can change and be improved. Oligarchy doesn't have to last forever, nor is tyranny permanent. People can seek and find better systems of government. The democratic values we live by today are the product of those struggles of that period. Every time you go to vote, you're actually experiencing the legacy of those bloody struggles in 7th century BC Greece. If you enjoyed this kind of deep historical analysis, please like the video and don't forget to subscribe. In the next video, we'll tell the story of Pericles' Athens and the world's first full democracy. Write in the comments which ancient topics you're curious about, and let's turn those into videos too.